Last month, I flew out to the East Coast to go collaborate with a couple of my friends. I first went to New York to pick up my best friend Sam, and then we drove down to Philadelphia to go learn from our buddy Eric. I put links to both their channels in the description box, so make sure you go check them out.
This is like a YouTube channel.
No idea what you're talking about.
This is a thing, people.
I believe you.
Sam and I wanted to make a thank you gift for Eric being so helpful and teaching us so much. And as you can see, Eric has a pretty epic beard, so we came up with the idea of making a DIY wood and resin beard comb. So keep watching to see what we were able to make. This video is sponsored by my friends at the Home Depot and is part of the Tool Prospective program. The whole process got started in Sam's shed shop. I've done a couple of epoxy resin projects before, but Sam's done quite a few more than me, so she was going to show me the ropes. Sam had a beautiful small slab of walnut that we decided to use the live edge of to make the combs.
Alright, so what's the plan?
So this piece is too thick.
Yeah, just a little. It might be a little hard to comb here.
It's eventually going to be a comb, but not yet.
To get the wood to a manageable size, we started passing the slab through a thickness planer. We took off about a 1/16 of an inch at a time until the slab was about 1/2 of an inch in total thickness. Now, this slab had irregular sides and it would have been difficult to cut on other types of saws, but a track saw is perfect. You can cut exactly where you want in a nice straight line. If you're not already subscribed to Pneumatic Addict, what are you waiting for? Click the button right below. Once the slab was cut into rough strips, Sam and I started brainstorming our design and deciding who gets what section.
I think it's going to make my life harder, but for some reason I really like it.
You want this part in it too?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because you could even, if you took out this center part and used that even,
that would
cool
be so
somehow.
cool.
That would be dope.
That would be dope. Okay.
And the cool thing about this one too is you've got grain going in so many different directions.
Right.
We're not going to have to worry about it's like snapping off, having teeth this way or that way. Right. You kind of have like a cross grain out in the bias.
Since we now had a straight edge on each of the boards to reference from, we took the pieces over to the miter saw to cut them to length. I decided I wanted a couple of my boards even more narrow, so I went over to the table saw and ripped them down. Once we each had 3 pieces of live edge wood, we turned our attention to the melamine forms. We first used 1 sheet of melamine with one of the pieces of wood to determine what the height of the forms was going to be. That would give us the width of the strips that we needed to cut for the form. Sam set and locked the fence of the table saw to allow us to cut strips that were about 1 1/4 inch thick. We then laid all the wood pieces on top of one of the melamine sheets and marked the sides so we knew how big we needed to make the bases of the forms. We then used a combination of the table saw and a miter saw to break the melamine down into the required dimensions. Sam taught me that epoxy resin forms are just like making concrete forms. The one major distinction is you need to line the inside of your epoxy forms with a non-stick tape. We use Tyvek tape, which is the type of tape that they use when they're wrapping a vapor barrier around a house. Once all the inside faces of the form pieces were wrapped, we started to assemble. Sam and I tag-teamed the process with having one of us pre-drill and the other one drive screws holding the pieces together. We were basically making 5 little boxes with no tops. With the forms built, we started working on our wood pieces. In order to make sure that the epoxy bonds well with the wood, I needed to remove any loose parts or the delicate outer bark of the live edge. Sanding worked okay, but there were a few little nooks and cracks that I had a hard time getting into. That's when I pulled out my Dremel Stylo and a wire brush attachment. That thing is awesome. It's so lightweight and easy to control, and it made short work of cleaning up that live edge. If you want more information about the products and tools that I used, I'll be writing about it in my blog, so check the description box for a link. Before we could add our wood pieces to the melamine forms, we needed to make sure that we sealed up all the seams. We ran a small bead of silicone caulk in between where all the pieces of the form met. We then used our fingers to smooth over the bead, creating a nice tight seal inside of the form. Once the caulk was dry, we could drop the wood pieces into place, making sure that it was a nice fit so that we wouldn't have too much wasted epoxy. The wood that we used was a little dry and a bit porous. We were concerned with it releasing air bubbles into our setting epoxy. To prevent this, we applied a little bit of a quick setting 5-minute epoxy to the live edge, everywhere that our colored epoxy was going to touch. With the forms built and the wood sealed, it was time for the star of the show. We used a 2-part deep pour epoxy resin from Moss Epoxy. We each started by mixing one large batch of clear epoxy that we would then break into colors later. Since this project is a little bit of a departure from what I normally build, DIY furniture, I'd love to know what you guys think about it. Tell me what you think in the comment section below. I read every comment and I really value your opinions. One really important tip when you're working with epoxy resin is make sure that you stir it very, very properly. Usually it will specify how long to stir it on the instructions, but a good rule of thumb is at least 2 to 5 minutes. The nice thing about a deep pour epoxy is not only are you able to pour deeper, like the name implies, but you have a longer working time as well. I decided to use 5 different colors with my combs and went with powdered mica pigments. If you want to see what I'm currently working on, make sure you follow me over on Instagram. It's where I'm the most active and I share some of the behind the scenes action. While you're watching, make sure you hit that thumbs up button. Another great tip that Sam clued me into is the fact that wood floats when you fill up the form with liquid. Before we started pouring the resin, we made sure to clamp the wood and the form down to a sturdy work surface so the wood couldn't float. Now finally, I got to start the fun part, pouring the epoxy resin. For the smallest comb, I went with orange, yellow, and kind of a tealish color. To help mix the colors together, I just used an old screw, but you can use a paintbrush or a stir stick or anything to kind of help stir the epoxy together a bit. The next comb was really cool. I used this super reflective copper color pigment. I wanted to create kind of a pattern and a lot of movement in the epoxy. Our good friend Matt Ketty does a lot of resin work, and he told us that if you drop rubbing alcohol into the resin while it's setting, it will kind of bubble up and boil and move and make all sorts of cool patterns. Now, something we discovered with this deep pour epoxy is that it's a pretty low viscosity, which means it's not going to set or gel for a while. We allowed it to cure for a couple of hours and then we came back and stirred it a little bit more to help mix up that powdered pigment from the bottom.
I actually mess up my new workbenches. It's like a year, they're not new anymore, right? It's fine. Time to break them. It's time to break them in, exactly.
Deep pour epoxy can take up to a couple of days to fully cure, depending on the room temperature and humidity. The nice thing about that long cure time is all the little air bubbles have their time to work their way to the surface and pop, so you don't have to take any extra steps to remove air bubbles. When we came back to New York, it was time to remove the forms, definitely the most nerve-wracking part of the whole process. A few of the pieces of melamine popped off really easily, but I did have a little bit of leakage, so some of the pieces took some muscle to get apart. I made sure I was careful and I was able to get all 3 blanks out undamaged. Sadly, at this point, I had to leave Sam and fly back home to Arizona. I loaded up my blanks in my suitcase and took them with me. Once I was home in my own shop, I could start the process of shaping the blanks into combs. I needed to level off the top surface of the blanks, as well as remove some of the thickness to make the combs a little bit more comb-like. It's a really bad idea to put something this small through a thickness planer by itself, so I created a quick little sled out of some scrap I had lying around. I temporarily attached the bottom of the blanks to the sled using the old blue tape and CA glue trick. Basically, you glue 2 layers of blue tape together using CA glue, and it works almost as double-sided tape. You don't actually get glue on either surface, and it's easy to pull apart when you're done. You can see my shop in the rental house is really tight, but I still had enough room to use my double-ended flip-top workbench with no problem. I'll leave a link in the description box if you want to check out that build video and maybe make one of your own. I never planed down epoxy before, so I was really cautious and started by taking extremely shallow passes, maybe only about a 32nd of an inch deep. By the way, I'm still in love with those inexpensive PVC outfeed rollers that I made. I was pleasantly surprised to see after several passes on the top side of the blanks that my epoxy was still intact and nice and smooth. I removed the blanks from the sled and then flipped them over just to clean up any of the squeezed out epoxy on the bottom side. I was really happy with the finish that I got right off the planer. I had to take a little sneak peek and wet down the blanks just to see how they would look. With the wood and epoxy blanks thinned down to about 1/4 of an inch, I trimmed them down to size a little bit more using my miter saw. This is another place where blue tape really comes in handy. Putting tape over both surfaces before I cut the blanks helped prevent the epoxy from chipping or splintering. Next, I had some big decisions to make. I had to lay out the design for each of the 3 combs. With the rough designs laid out, I moved to the bandsaw. You don't have to use a bandsaw for this project. The one that I have is actually really inexpensive and probably not super accurate, but it seemed to work okay. You could probably get away with a scroll saw or even a hand saw if you're pretty patient. I marked 1/8 of an inch increments on a scrap piece of wood and then screwed it to my miter gauge. I figured it would be a lot easier to make the repeated cuts necessary for the teeth that way. I tested my cutting pattern on a piece of scrap and it seemed to work great. Time to start cutting the real thing. I'll admit, I was really nervous at this point. I really didn't want to break one of these blanks that I had put so much time into. To make matters worse, this is the blank that I had decided was going to be the beard comb for Eric. I made the first cut to the depth that I had indicated with a pencil mark on the blank. Then, leaving the blank in place against the blade, I set up a stop block using a speed square and a clamp. This way, hopefully each tooth will be cut to the exact same depth. I was very careful, and fortunately, this technique seemed to work out. For this beard comb design, I wanted smaller, tighter teeth, so I made the teeth only about 1/8 of an inch wide. The goal was to create a wide tooth comb out of the copper blank, so for that, I tried a little bit different technique for the teeth. I angled the miter gauge 3 degrees off square, and that way I could make repeated angled cuts. I made all my cuts go in one direction, and then I realized I would have a hard time clearing out the space at the very back of the tooth. I used a 1/8 inch drill bit to drill a space where the 2 angled lines would meet. If I was thinking ahead, I should have drilled those holes before I made any of the cuts. I flipped the blank over and then made all my cuts go in the opposite direction, and it created really nicely evenly spaced triangular shaped teeth. For the third and final blank, I wanted to create a comb with a handle. I used a similar technique as the wide tooth comb to cut the teeth on this one, but then I used the bandsaw to rough out the handle shape. Then it was time for sanding. Lots and lots of sanding. I would love a benchtop sander, but in the meantime, a belt sander clamp to the workbench worked okay. In order for the teeth to glide smoothly through the hair, they need to have a tapered edge. The belt sander worked perfect for cutting in an initial bevel, almost like shaping a knife. I was able to keep working at it and eventually round the bevel over. Another quick little tip that I learned about epoxy: if it gets too warm, it will get soft and start to deform. So every once in a while, if I felt like my combs were getting too soft, I'd pop them in the freezer before going back to sanding. To get in between the teeth, I pulled out my Dremel Stylo again. This thing was a total lifesaver. I discovered a sanding disc fit perfectly between the teeth and helped me polish off any uneven edges. I was also able to shape the teeth and round over the sides a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of felt like a dentist. Eventually I got to the point with all 3 combs that I just had to do some hand sanding. A lot, in fact. I probably spent at least an hour per comb just sanding and smoothing and shaping a little bit more. I worked my way up through the grits and eventually finished with an 800 grit sandpaper. I know that's really high, but for something that you're going to hold so often, it makes a big difference in the feel. After lots and lots of dust and a lot of elbow grease, it was time to put on the finish. Thankfully, since I don't plan on chewing on my combs, I didn't need to use a food-safe finish. I used Simple Finish, which is a penetrating oil from Maker Brand Co. If you really want something that's food safe, you can always go with mineral oil and beeswax. Once I had buffed the second coat, it was time to give my combs a try. My sister-in-law has longer hair than me, so I talked her into being a model for a second. I think my favorite is the wide tooth copper colored one, but I was also really happy with the little rainbow colored beard comb. I don't have a beard, as you can see, but it worked just fine on my hair. I love how the epoxy resin is slightly translucent when you catch it in the sun. In my book, you can't go wrong with walnut, and I'm really glad that I got some more experience using epoxy resin. If you want to see a few of the other projects I've experimented on, make sure you check out this video. And this one too. What do you guys think about epoxy resin projects? Do you want to see me work with it more? Let me know in the comment section below. As always, thanks for watching, guys.